Dead America, the Second Month, The Portland Conflict, Part 6. Written by Derek Slaton. Narrated by Aaron Smith. Chapter 1. Day 0 plus 41. The bullets flew through the front of the building, but were getting quieter the further Corporal Jinx ran from them. He didn't look back at Zion and Private Stein, who were staying behind to hold down the fort, because he didn't have a second to spare. He knew they were on the clock, that the entire weight of this professional army would be bearing down on them shortly. In the back of his mind, he knew it was unlikely they would make it out of this alive. But if he was going down, he would go down trying to save his team. Jinx made it to the final classroom in the building, bursting in through the door and running to the open window. He quickly tossed out the canvas bag full of handguns before diving out of it, landing awkwardly on his back on the ground. He didn't even bother to check and see if it was safe. There was no time, and any hesitation made their window of escape smaller and smaller. He immediately sprinted along the backside of the buildings, darting across the alleyway between the two structures. His gaze was focused straight ahead, but out of the corner of his eye he saw 2 truckloads of men show up and unload. They were all armed with rifles, dressed like the military, and moving like it too. Jinx knew that most, if not all, of these men and women were trained by the same people who trained him. They just went a different way in life. None of that mattered at the moment, though, as there wasn't a possibility of reasoning with them, nor the time. He had to get to his squad before it was too late. Jinx pumped his legs hard, to the point where his muscles burned. He pushed through it, getting up to the next gap between buildings. He paused for a brief second, only to catch his breath. The corporal looked out, seeing nobody within his view, so he quickly moved up, handgun at the ready. He spotted 2 guards by the sanctuary, or at least where he'd been told the sanctuary was. He looked over at the other buildings, none of which had guards. Presumably everybody else had left to join the battle. "That's my building," he thought. "Only reason those guards are still there." He checked his handgun, finding his magazine half full. He swapped it out for a full one, which he wasn't a fan of, but he had little choice. He was going to be running and gunning, so the more bullets at the ready, the better. He took one quick deep breath, steadying himself, before bursting out from behind cover. He ran as hard as he could towards the sanctuary, keeping a keen eye on the guards, whose attention was focused on the battle down the street. Jinx made it halfway across the street before one of the guards looked in his direction. As soon as they reacted, he raised his gun and opened fire. He aimed as best he could, pulling the trigger as quickly as he could and hoping for the best. The guards had rifles and bulletproof vests, which put Jinx at a severe disadvantage. His bullet spray, however, was a lot more effective than he could have ever imagined. The first volley of shots were aimed at the guard that was raising his rifle. A couple hit him in the vest, which stunned him, sending him to the ground in a mountain of pain and ripping the breath from his lungs, possibly breaking ribs. Before his buddy could react, Jinx fired in his direction, most of them missing, but one catching him in the neck. The guard dropped his rifle, hands coming up to the geyser of blood spraying out from the wound. Jinx clicked empty on his handgun, dropping the magazine out and slapping in the half-empty one as he got close to the building. The bulletproof guard struggled to get his rifle up, but Jinx was there quickly enough. He aimed his gun directly at the man's head and pulled the trigger, ending his pain and his life. Jinx grabbed their rifles, slinging them inside the building. As they clattered to the floor, several bullets impacted the wall next to him. He turned his attention down the street, spotting several militia moving up in formation, sending round after round in his direction. Jinx knew he needed more ammunition, but he didn't have time to stop. He dove inside, slamming the doors shut behind him. He looked around frantically for something to bar them, but couldn't find anything. "Damn it," he muttered. There was nothing he could do, so he grabbed both rifles, slinging one around his shoulder and taking control of the other before running down the hallway. He took a brief look at the blood-soaked walls, a queasy feeling overcoming his gut. "My God, if this is the place my squad is at, I hope I'm in time," he thought, peeking through the windows of the classroom as he moved, hoping he spotted some sign of life. Instead, all he found were bodies, horrifically mutilated, blood and guts coating everything. A real horror show. As he worked his way down the hallway, the doors opened behind him. At the first crack of the metal latch coming open, he turned and fired several rifle rounds downrange. The bullets ripped through the door, forcing the enemy back outside, the doors shutting back. This gave him enough time to get to the stairwell at the end of the hall, making it inside and shutting the door. He rapidly ascended the stairs, stopping at the second-floor door and pausing. He thought for a beat, trying to figure out some way to buy himself some time. There was another floor above him, and he had no way of knowing which one would be what he needed. He pulled open the second-floor door, looking down the hallway and seeing that it looked similar to the ground floor. He gently shut it, doing his best to leave it ajar. He had no idea if it would fool the men following him, but it was worth a try. With the door slightly propped open, he rushed up to the third floor, quickly getting inside and gently shutting the door as he heard the bottom one open up. Jinx immediately whirled around, scanning the hallway for anything of value. While he couldn't see anything, he could hear music coming from the far end. He walked up to the first door looking into the classroom. His heart soared at the sight of Davila, Birch and Rollins very much alive, chained to chairs in a semicircle. "Look at you boys, just lounging around," he drawled. "Holy shit, Jinx!" Davila blurted. "How the hell did you find us?" Birch asked. "Because I'm damn good at what I do," Jinx huffed, and walked over to Rollins, smashing the restraints in order to free him. It took a couple of strikes, but he got it done. "But we'll have to leave it at that because I'm not alone." He gave Rollins the rifle from his shoulder as he moved behind Birch. "Wait," he paused, looking around. "Where's Jarvis?" "Church took her," Rollins said as he began to work on Davila's bonds. "Who the fuck is Church?" Jinx asked. "Big bastard of a man, just follow the music," Birch grunted. Jinx strained his ears, remembering the music from the far end of the hall. "Disco?" he asked. "It was funk earlier," Davila muttered. Jinx dropped the bag of handguns on the ground, reaching in and pulling out a fresh mag, swapping his out while pocketing a fresh one. "Got a squad on my heels, and Zion is with Stein, and they're having a bad day," he said. "I'm going to go take care of Church and get Jarvis back. Then we're on the move." Rollins aimed his rifle at the door as Birch and Davila grabbed handguns, the latter slinging the bag over his shoulder. Birch ran across to the other classroom across the hall as Davila turned to Jinx. "I'm going with you," he said firmly. "I can handle it," the corporal snapped. "Trust me," Davila insisted. "You're going to need help." His tone put some concern into Jinx, and he knew there was no time to argue, so he nodded. "Let's go then," he said. The duo moved quickly down the hallway, knowing that the assault force wouldn't be spending too much time on the second floor. The music in the distance continued, but there were no screams at least. When they reached the door of the classroom that was lit up inside, Jinx leaned into the window to peer inside. Jarvis was tied down to a table, her shirt torn in several places, blood slowly soaking into the fabric. "She's moving," Jinx whispered. "I'll take care of her," Davila promised. Jinx nodded and threw open the door. They rushed inside, the private walking straight up to the table. "I got you, girl," he promised. "You okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine," she bit out, more angry-sounding than scared. "Just some cuts." Jinx had his handgun at the ready, moving around the edges of the interior of the room. There were various dividers set up around the edges adorned with a variety of horrific things. Some could best be described as bloody finger painting. There were a few scantily clad women on the boards that had been taken from various adult magazines. Jinx continued to go along the segments, looking for Church, but nobody jumped out at him. He turned back to Davila, who nearly had Jarvis off of the table. "Get her back to the classroom and arm up," Jinx said. "We're going to have to—" Before he could finish, gunfire erupted at the far end of the hallway. The two of them nodded, running out of the room, Davila with his gun up and aiming towards the doorway at the end of the hall. Before Jinx could follow them, one of the dividers flung out in his direction. He narrowly avoided getting hit, trying to raise his gun in its general direction. Before he could find a target, a beast of a man emerged, slashing downwards with a shining, sharp hatchet. Jinx moved his hand out of the way, just enough to avoid losing it. But the edge of the blade nicked him, causing him to drop his gun. Church didn't stop his attack, rushing Jinx and using his larger frame to smack Jinx down to the ground. The impact from the arm shot was enough to send Jinx sliding across the floor, smacking his head on one of the dividers. "I don't remember inviting you into my sanctuary," Church bellowed. "I'm going to make you wish I didn't find it," Jinx quipped, and hopped up, drawing his knife and getting into an attack position. "Let's dance," Church invited, his eyes wild and alight with sadistic glee. He lunged forward, swinging the hatchet downwards. Jinx dodged, countering with a gut-level slash, which Church mostly avoided, doing a half-jump back. The tip of the blade sliced along the front of his blood-soaked smock. Jinx gathered himself, darting forward to stab him in the gut, but Church grabbed him by the wrist, moving out of the way and pulling it forward as hard as he could. Jinx was out of control from the force of the pull, stumbling as he narrowly avoided slamming into more of the dividers. "Just so you know, I didn't really hurt the girl," Church declared. "Didn't take much prodding for her to open up to me." "The fact that you touched her at all leaves me no choice but to slice you up," Jinx snarled. "Oh, you're a bold one," Church exclaimed giddily. "I like you. It's a shame they couldn't have brought you here first. We could have had some fun together." The gunfire in the hallway intensified, and a small explosion rattled the windows in the room. "But that fun is going to have to wait," Church said, and whipped the hatchet in Jinx's direction. The corporal barely got out of the way in time, diving onto the floor. The weapon embedded itself into one of the dividers, right in between centerfolds of Miss June and Miss July. Jinx scrambled to his feet to continue pursuit, but Church was gone. A lone divider was still slightly moving, pulled behind him as he ran out the door. "You can run, but you're officially on my shit list," Jinx muttered, leaning down and picking up his handgun. He shook off some of the blood from his primary hand, glancing at the wound. It was fairly deep, requiring stitches, but he didn't have the luxury of dealing with it at the moment. He quickly looked around, finding a thin rag and wrapping it up. Jinx ran to the door, peeking out down the hallway towards the raging battle. He could see muzzle flashes through the smoke from the explosive, some at the stairwell door, and some from the classrooms. Jinx heard the latch on the stairwell door behind him click, and he quickly ducked back into the classroom. He planted himself against the wall beside the door, looking around the corner of the frame towards the hallway. A few seconds later, 2 militiamen moved up cautiously, their assault rifles trained down the hallway, one aiming at each classroom where his men were. Jinx waited patiently for them to get a couple steps past him before quietly stepping out into the hallway. He steadied himself before raising his handgun towards the back of one of their heads. He pulled the trigger, exploding the man's head before quickly aiming towards the other man. The poor bastard never had a chance to turn around and see his executioner before Jinx pulled the trigger. He crumpled to the ground alongside his partner. Jinx quickly knelt down, grabbing one of their rifles to join the fight at the end of the hallway, when he noticed a grenade on one of their belts. A sly grin etched across his face as he picked it up and pulled the pin with his teeth. The corporal ran towards the stairwell door at the far end of the hallway, staying to his right so he was out of direct view of the gunmen, who were still taking cover behind a partially opened door. Jinx got within 15 yards of the door when he released the lever, which flipped up in the air before clanging on the floor. Jinx did his best bowling impersonation, underhanding the grenade and sliding it across the slick linoleum. His aim was true, the grenade sliding through the slight opening in the doorway, the gunfire coming from inside the stairwell cut off, replaced by panicked screaming. It only lasted a few seconds before the device detonated. Jinx didn't stop, sprinting up to the door and kicking it open, sweeping the area with his brand-new assault rifle. There were a trio of bodies on the landing, mangled beyond recognition. One man on the next landing down, who appeared to have dove down the stairs, moved slowly, trying to recover from the pain of his body hitting the concrete stairs. He likely also had a concussion from the blast in such a small area. Jinx didn't give him the opportunity to get back to his feet, pumping several rounds into him from above. As the man slumped to the ground, Jinx stood there, tense, for several moments. He aimed his rifle down the stairwell, waiting for anybody else to dare to come up towards them. When he was satisfied they were alone, he came back to the hallway where his troops stood, a little battered and more than a little rattled. Rollins sat on the ground inside the classroom, blood pouring from a cut on his forehead. Birch was unscathed coming out of the classroom across the hall, and Davila and Jarvis looked shell-shocked but otherwise okay. "Rollins, you good, buddy?" Jinx asked. "Almost got my head blown off," he said dryly. "But other than that, I'm fine." Jinx held up his wounded hand. "Almost had my hand cut off, so right there with you," he said. "Is that motherfucker dead?" Jarvis demanded, rage in her eyes. "No, he escaped," Jinx said, shaking his head. She stepped forward, grimacing at the movement of the numerous cuts on her body. "Then we're going after him," she snarled. "No time," Jinx said. "We have to get to Zion and Stein and get the hell out of here." "He made me talk," she said, a note of desperation creeping up in her voice. "I told them about Seattle, how badly we're lacking ammo, everything." "It's okay," Jinx assured her, staring her firmly in the eyes. "You did what you had to do in order to survive, and I know you want revenge, but we have bigger concerns." She took a deep, shuddering breath, but fell in line. "Where are Zion and Stein?" Birch asked. "Last building on the row, across the street," Jinx said. "Whole mess of those guys showed up." "Well, let's go get them then," Davila said, raising his gun. The group armed themselves with the fallen militiamen's rifles and checked their ammunition. Jinx picked up a lone unexploded grenade and led his squad down the stairwell towards their friends, again hoping beyond hope that he wouldn't be too late. Chapter 2. Zion and Stein sat on either side of the hallway, bullets continuing to rip through the front doors several minutes after Jinx had vanished into the classroom at the end of the hallway. Zion poked his head barely around the corner, looking at the situation out front. 2 pickup trucks had been moved out there, providing the 10 or so militiamen some cover. Zion tried to get a read on their positions, but had to come back behind cover as more bullets came through. "Stein, we can't stay here, brother," Zion called. He blindly aimed his rifle towards the doors, firing off the rest of the half-dozen rounds, the gun clicking empty. He tossed it aside in frustration. Stein held up a couple of handguns, and Zion nodded as he was ready for them. The private slid them as hard as he could across the floor, both weapons reaching him without much trouble. Then he slid a few extra mags after. "Use them sparingly, because that's all I got too," Stein called. "No rifle ammo?" Zion asked. Stein shook his head. "No," he said. Both men paused as the bullets stopped, which concerned both of them. Zion poked his head out, finding several of the gunmen behind the trucks were missing. "They're coming for us," he said. "From where?" Stein asked. Before Zion could respond, one of the classroom doors opened up about 15 yards away from Stein. 2 militiamen burst through it, firing their guns towards the private, only missing him because he was sitting on the ground. Both men opened fire, handgun rounds striking the lead militia in the vest, knocking him to the ground. They laid down suppressing fire as they retreated into the classroom. "Up the stairs!" Zion barked. "Move!" Stein didn't hesitate, getting up and running down the hallway. Zion was a step behind him, aiming back towards the trucks and firing as he ran. The men outside opened fire, barely missing Zion as he bolted to catch up with Stein. Miraculously, they made it to the stairwell, with Zion busting through the doorway to find the private on the ground. "You okay?" he demanded. Stein held his wound, letting out a groan of pain. He picked himself up off of the ground shakily, but the wound was bleeding profusely. "Yeah, I just ripped the stitches," he grunted. "Fucking hell, that stings." "Only thing that will sting more is a fresh one," Zion quipped. "Come on, we gotta get to higher ground." Stein nodded as Zion took him by the arm, helping him up the stairs. As they moved, footsteps echoed from the hallway, and Zion picked up the pace, getting the private up to the landing and pushing him forward. "Find us a spot. I'll buy us some time," Zion said. Stein nodded and rushed up the next set of stairs and into the second-floor hallway to find a stronghold. Zion turned his attention to the doorway, aiming his handgun towards it. He looked at it, realizing it wouldn't do much against a vest. "No way in hell I'm good enough of a shot to land a headshot," he muttered. He debated with himself for a beat, knowing what he had to do. He rushed down the stairs, taking up position by the door. He put the handgun in the back of his belt, along with the other one, and pulled out his knife. He planted his back against the wall, just beside the door on the side that opened outwards. He could hear the footsteps outside slowing down and stopping just outside the door. There were a tense few seconds where he gripped his blade tightly, just waiting for the assault to begin. He hoped that their numbers weren't too great, because, as good as he was, he could easily get overwhelmed. Finally, the door cracked open slowly. The edge of the rifle barrel crossed the threshold, the man on the trigger sweeping the area. Zion waited patiently for his opportunity to strike, and the man's hand crossed the threshold. Zion grabbed it along with the barrel, pulling it forward as hard as he could, jamming his knife at head level with as much force as he could muster. The man fired the rifle a couple of times, the first as a panic shot, the second as an involuntary reaction to being stabbed in the face. His partner started shooting into the stairwell, putting the rifle on his now dead friend's shoulder and firing. This forced Zion to let go of both the gun and the knife, ducking down to avoid taking a round to the head. The militiaman with the knife in his face started to slump down, and Zion saw this, knowing that if the body was out of the way, then he was a sitting duck. Zion gambled knowing it was his only play, and darted towards the falling body. He managed to catch it as it fell, driving it back into his partner. As Zion emerged from the door, he continued to drive his legs hard, trying to pin the active shooter against the wall, or, at a minimum, throw him off balance. Zion shoved the corpse forward, the dead weight knocking the weapon out of the other shooter's hands. He glanced around, relieved it was just the two of them in the hallway, though he knew it wasn't going to last for very long. The still-standing militiaman started to draw his handgun, but Zion grabbed his hand and shoved it to the side, slamming it into the wall before he could take aim. An errant shot fired, hitting the floor nowhere close to them. Zion slammed his hand against the wall a couple of times before dislodging the weapon. The militiaman responded by using his other hand to punch him in the kidneys, stunning him just enough that he could break free. The enemy swung with a haymaker, narrowly missing Zion as he leaned as far back as he could, losing his balance in the process. He fell onto his ass, using his feet to kick on the floor and slide back a bit, putting some distance between them. The militiaman continued his assault without a break, reaching down and grabbing the knife from his friend's face, yanking it out, and immediately attacking Zion with it. He rolled out of the way as his opponent tried to dive on top of him, landing in a crouched position, the tip of the blade slamming into the floor. Zion leapt to his feet, as did his adversary. He squared up, and the militiaman did the same, brandishing the knife and giving a mocking hand gesture to egg Zion on. He smirked with a slight nod, as if he were going to come at him with everything he had. Instead, he quickly drew one of his handguns and fired, the bullet hitting the man in the forehead from just a couple yards away. The militiaman looked shocked at his quick death, before collapsing to the ground. "I'm not the best shot, but even I can hit the target from that distance," Zion spat. But before he could move a muscle, bullets ripped through what was left of the glass at the front doors, barely missing him. He darted back into the stairwell, snatching up an assault rifle as he went. Zion ran up the stairs, pausing at the first landing, taking up position by the railing and aiming down. With the more powerful weapon, he didn't have to worry about headshots, as the rifle would shred bulletproof vests. He lay in wait, listening for footsteps thundering down the hallway. Instead of just two, he could hear a small army's worth. His stomach knotted, and he glanced down at his single magazine. Well, less than a single magazine, actually. It dawned on him that he didn't even know how many bullets had been fired from the gun. It was a moot point, because he didn't have time to check it. The only thing he could do was hope there was enough to stave off an attack. "Jinx, you better not be taking your sweet-ass time," he thought, shaking his head, "because I don't think this battle is going to last too long." He shook his head, focusing on the door as the latch clicked down. He steadied himself, waiting for the first sign of an enemy. It didn't take long as one man took a half step inside the door. Zion got ahead of himself, firing a little too soon and hitting the door instead of the man. "Damn it," he muttered. The intruder quickly darted back out the door. "Yeah, that's what I thought, bitch," Zion bellowed. "You ain't getting in here that easy." Stall, stall, stall. A few seconds passed where nothing happened, and then an explosion of gunfire echoed. A handgun appeared in the doorway, firing wildly up towards Zion's position. The closest bullet hit the railing about 6 inches from him, which was enough to get him to fall back to safety. As he scrambled to his feet to get back into a firing position, the gunfire from below stopped. A split second later, a grenade made a graceful arc up into the corner of the landing he was on. Zion made eye contact with it, but it took a brief second for his brain to process exactly what it was. Shit. He made a run for the door at the top of the next set of stairs, managing to get to the landing as the device detonated, causing him to fling face first into the wall. Zion was dazed from the impact and the concussive nature of the blast. He knew he was about to have company, though, so he willed himself up off of the ground and made it through the door. "Stein! Where are you?" he yelled. "Stein!" "Second door on the right," came the muffled reply. Zion quickly ran down the hallway, making the turn to where he was. He looked inside at some heavy metal desks that had been turned on their side, the private in position beside them. "Best I could do on short notice," the soldier said sheepishly. "These fuckers have grenades," Zion replied. "We need an exit strategy." "Windows are a no-go," Stein said, jerking a thumb over his shoulder. "They have metal shutters on them." "Shit," Zion huffed. "Okay, start working on them. I'll hold them off as long as I can at the door." "We need to switch that up," Stein said. "I nearly ripped my arm off getting these tables turned over. I don't have the strength to do the shutters." Zion nodded, motioning for the soldier to come over to the door. He handed over the rifle, patting him on his good shoulder. Stein gave him a nod before taking a seat by the door, putting the rifle up to his good shoulder, and getting situated to use the weapon with his off hand. Zion ran over to the window, opening it up and inspecting the metal shutters, trying to find the weak point. Finally, he spotted the hinges in the middle. He hopped up on the counter that ran along the windows and started bashing into the hinges with his shoulder. As he worked on that, Stein opened fire, sending a few rounds down towards the stairwell. He was forced back into the room as several shots came his way. He returned fire, but quickly ran out of bullets. The private crawled on the ground with his good arm, struggling to get back to his feet and over the barricade. The footsteps were coming down the hall, loud and plentiful, and he knew he didn't have time to get over, so he pulled out his two handguns, propping himself against the barricade and aiming towards the door. As soon as the first militiaman came through the opening, Stein started pulling the trigger. One of the bullets caught the man in the leg, sending him to the ground in pain. A couple of his friends popped their guns around the corner of the door, firing blindly, one high and one low. The bullets nearly missed Zion, who had gotten one side of the hinges off of its moorings, with the other side still attached. The bullets hitting the wall forced him to jump down to the ground. "Stein, you good?" Zion cried. There was no answer, and his guts sank. "Stein!" he yelled. The private gurgled a bit, a bullet lodged deep into his belly. "Been a fun ride, Zion," Stein choked out. Zion let out a defeated sigh, knowing his companion was a goner. A few more bullets flew from both Stein and the gunman at the door, followed by the unmistakable sound of a grenade bouncing off of the linoleum. Zion grunted, forcing himself up off of the ground and running to the window. He put his foot on a nearby chair, launching himself towards the window and putting the full weight of his shoulder into it. Luckily, he'd weakened it enough that it gave way once he hit it. As he plummeted to the ground below, he managed to push the broken shutter away from him. While this softened his landing a bit, the impact was still enough to knock the wind out of him. He was relieved to hit grass and not the pavement about 10 yards to his left, but it was still a rough ride. Zion struggled to move, trying to pick himself up off of the ground before the gunman could get to the window. As he pushed up against the ground, his arms quivering from the pain and exhaustion, shots went off. He braced himself for pain, but, much to his surprise, there were no bullet impacts to him or the ground near him. He looked up, finding Jinx and Davila running up, the corporal focused solely on the window and laying down suppressing fire. There was more in the distance coming from the other side of the building, and Davila reached over to pick up Zion. "I got you, bud. I got you," he said. "Where's Stein?" Jinx demanded. Zion shook his head, pain in his voice. "Didn't make it," he said. Jinx let out a frustrated growl as he fired a few more shots up towards the window. Zion couldn't tell if he was shooting at someone in particular or letting out his anger, but it was clear the corporal was pissed beyond belief. "I'm going to burn this whole fucking town to the ground," Jinx roared, "if it's the last thing I do." "Another time, Jinx," Zion huffed. "We gotta go." The corporal fired a couple more rounds towards the window as a rifle appeared in it, firing in their direction. He managed to hit the weapon, causing it to fall back into the classroom. The trio took off running, getting as close to the building as they could and into the alleyway. "You got a weapon?" Davila asked. Zion nodded and pulled on the last remaining handgun he had. Jinx was at the head of the line, leading them up the side of the building. It was clear there was an intense gun battle happening up ahead, but the specifics weren't known to them yet. Jinx got to the top of the building, looking around the corner. To his left were Jarvis, Birch, and Rollins, who were spread out on the battlefield. Jarvis had taken up a position behind a column at the second building, while Birch and Rollins were in the street, taking up a position behind a truck. To his right, Jinx saw 4 militiamen who were behind 2 trucks. They were in the middle of the road, but about 40 yards to the right. While their attention was focused on the trio shooting at them, his position was in their peripheral vision. "Wait here," Jinx said. "And do what?" Davila asked. "When I start shooting, you start shooting," Jinx instructed, and sprinted back towards the back of the building, making the turn and reaching the window he first breached, diving inside. He ran to the door, not pausing to see if it was clear, knowing time wasn't on his side. Instead, he rushed through it, sprinting up the hallway, getting a few classrooms up before darting inside a darkened one. As he shut the door, footsteps echoed from the direction of the stairwell. Jinx didn't shut the door, not wanting to risk the sound alerting them to his presence. He knew they would know where he was soon enough. He made it to the window, opening it up quickly and looking outside. He was directly behind the militia members firing at his team. All of their backs were to him, none the wiser to his existence. He aimed his rifle and mowed them down. His aim was spot on, hitting each of the men in the back before any of them could figure out what was going on. A few moments later, they were all down, his troops coming out from behind cover and moving up towards the trucks. Jinx, meanwhile, heard footsteps coming down the hallway as the gunfire outside kicked them back up. He glanced over and spotted Jarvis shooting towards the direction of the front door of the building. He didn't have time to worry about that, because he had company of his own to deal with. He turned towards the door and sent a few rounds through it before the footsteps reached him. He rushed over to the wall beside the door as bullets began to pierce it. He slid down, putting his shoulder against the wall while crouched, aiming his rifle towards the door. The bullets shattered the locking mechanism, causing the door to swing open. Jinx got a view of one of the militia men in the hallway, pumping several rounds into him with his rifle. As he did this, his rifle clicked empty. The other gunmen outside came into the room, both of them getting into a standoff, their rifles pointed at each other's heads. Jinx knew that his empty rifle click hadn't been heard, because if it had been, he wouldn't still be standing. "What do you say we call it a day and try later?" the corporal drawled. "Pretty sure my calendar's free next week." "You're not leaving this room alive," the militiaman snapped. Jinx gave him a shrug and a wink, and before his opponent could so much as breathe, a shot rang out, a rifle round punching straight through his temple. The corporal stood there for a brief moment, collecting himself after that extremely close call. He looked over at the window where Davila stood. "You good, Jinx?" the private asked. "Yeah," Jinx replied, pulling the trigger to show his weapon was empty. "Appreciate the assist." Frantic yells erupted outside, and Davila looked wildly back the way he'd come. "You better get out, Jinx," he cried. The corporal grabbed the fallen man's rifle before sprinting down the hallway to the front door. He made the turn, finding several dead bodies on the ground inside the doorway just outside. He hopped over them to emerge into the sunlight. Birch leapt behind the wheel of one of the trucks, starting it up as Rollins and Jarvis hopped in the back. Davila got into the front. "We're taking 2 trucks," Jinx said. "You sure?" Zion asked. "Only way we're getting out of here is going through that wall," the corporal replied with a firm nod. "Need a battering ram." "I'm in," Zion said, hopping into the passenger seat of the other truck as Jinx got into the driver's seat. He looked straight ahead down the road that cut through the buildings, and 3 more trucks worth of militiamen showed up. They stopped, fanning out to block the road. Jinx leaned out the window to yell to Birch. "You stay on my ass," he called. "If I get taken down, you keep driving until you get to the wall. It's fairly flimsy metal, so you should be able to punch through it." "I'm on your 6, Birch yelled back. "Let's get the hell out of here." "When I give you the signal, you open fire with that rifle," Jinx said to Zion. "Don't care if you hit anything, just fire in their direction." His passenger cocked a brow. "How much you want me to fire?" he asked. "Until you can't see them anymore," Jinx replied. Zion's brow furrowed in confusion, but he nodded and rolled down his window. "Here goes nothing," the corporal said, and floored it. The truck quickly picked up speed, and the enemy vehicles did the same, heading straight for them on a collision course. As soon as Jinx made it to the edge of the building, he yelled, "Now!" and cut the wheel hard. Zion opened fire, wildly shooting towards the oncoming enemies, completely unsure if he had hit anything because he was flinging around inside the cab. Jinx glanced back, seeing that Birch's truck was following with the enemy trucks about 30 yards behind. There was no road, just open fields, so it was a bumpy ride. Rollins and Jarvis held on for dear life in the back of the truck, laying in the bed and bracing themselves against the railing. There were a few shots coming from the pursuing vehicles, but nothing landed as nobody could get a straight shot off. After several moments, they finally made it to the road. Jinx cut the wheel hard, screeching the tires and fishtailing before regaining control. Birch's truck did the same thing before speeding to catch up with Jinx. Once they were on smoother ground, both Jarvis and Rollins were able to prop themselves up in the bed, firing back towards the pursuing trucks. "Engine block!" Jarvis barked. Rollins nodded, and both of them concentrated their fire on the lead vehicle's engine. They managed to land several rounds into the front of the truck. A few moments later, there was a significant amount of smoke coming from the engine, with flames quickly following. The truck was forced to slam on the brakes, swerving off the road, nearly taking out one of the other trucks as they went. The other driver was really good, speeding up to avoid the collision, but backing off once Jarvis put a few bullets through their windshield. "You remember where you're going?" Zion asked. "Kind of," Jinx replied. Zion smirked, shaking his head. Jinx continued to lead his mini convoy down the residential road, bullets flying in all directions. Jinx looked in the side mirror to see what was going on, only for a bullet to take it clean off of the vehicle. "Guess it's going well," he muttered, and hit his turn signal to let Birch know what the next move was. He slammed on the brakes and cut hard to the right, making a tight turn into the neighborhood that led up to the golf course. Birch was able to make the turn as well, but one of the pursuing trucks missed it, sliding off of the road. The other one made it and stayed hot on their tail. Jinx sped along the road towards the golf course as Jarvis and Rollins continued to fire at the truck behind them. They tried to hit the engine, but the truck wove back and forth, missing out on any major damage. Jinx came up over a hill, spotting a golf course in the distance. He also spotted another truck speeding towards them, with several men in the back. They caught them off guard, neither vehicle expecting to have seen each other. There was just enough distance for Jinx to draw his handgun and open fire as they passed. At least one of the bullets found its mark, because the truck lost control, careening off of the road at an alarmingly high speed. Zion looked back, watching it crash headfirst into a tree, sending the men in the back flying through the air, crashing hard into the ground. "Damn fine shooting, brother," Zion commended. "Just some dumb luck," Jinx muttered. "Hey, I ain't mad at it," Zion quipped. Jinx let out a quick chuckle before focusing on speeding down the residential street. Finally, they spotted the golf course in the distance, making the turn for the driveway with Birch and the last truck still in pursuit. "Hang on, this is going to suck," the corporal warned, and went off the road, driving on the grass before hitting the fairway. At first it was a gentle descent down the slope, but he began swerving back and forth to avoid the bunkers and trees in the area. They came up to a green on a raised landing. Jinx hit it hard, flying through the air and clearing it, landing on the downward slope on the other side. Zion looked back and saw Rollins's legs in the air as he and Jarvis hung on. Jinx drove the truck off of the golf course and into much rougher terrain. The gunfire behind them had largely subsided as the terrain was much too bumpy for anybody to get proper aim, without risking flying out of the back of the truck. After a solid couple of minutes of driving, they spotted the wall up ahead. Jinx reached across his body, grabbing the seatbelt and putting it on. Zion saw this and did the same, preparing for the worst. Jinx was hyper-focused, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he put the pedal to the floor, picking up as much speed as possible. Both men let out primal yells as they approached the wall. The impact sounded horrific. The engine roared and metal scraped deafeningly against metal. The truck was forceful enough to punch through, however, sending several pieces of sheet metal flying in every direction. Jinx struggled to maintain control of the truck as some of the fence wedged beneath the vehicle, blowing out one of the tires. He did the only thing he could and slammed on the brakes as not only had he lost control, but the edge of the tree line came up quickly. Despite his best efforts, the vehicle went sideways, and with the blown tire it began to roll over. It flipped over several times before coming to a rest against a tree, while upside down. After his head smacking directly into the steering wheel, Jinx sat dazed. Zion was a little better off, shaking off the impact and immediately going to work on his seatbelt, which was holding him in place, upside down. He managed to find the release, slamming down into the glass-covered roof of the truck. Jinx let out some moaning as he began to come back into focus. "Jinx, you good, brother?" Zion asked. "Yeah. Sorry, man," Jinx groaned. "Not my best parking job." Zion chuckled. "Yeah, you're good," he said. He helped the corporal undo his belt, bracing him so he didn't land head first in glass. As he did that, gunfire erupted behind them. "Come on, we gotta move," he urged, looking back and kicking out the remaining glass in his window to give them a way out. As he started to climb out, he was startled by a zombie hand reaching down and grabbing the window frame. Zion gave it a quick kick, and the ghoul looked down, sending its head flinging back. This gave Zion enough time to draw his handgun, firing it at near point-blank range. As the creature fell, Zion looked past it and spotted several sets of zombie feet shambling towards them. The closest one was about 10 yards away, but there were more than he wanted to see, stretched out another yards past that. "We gotta move, now!" Zion cried. Jinx nodded, and the two of them crawled out of the overturned truck. Zion spotted Birch's vehicle parked in front of the woods. Birch and Davila sent shots down towards the enemy vehicle, which was set up in a defensive position, while Rollins and Jarvis fired back into the woods at the zombies. As Zion and Jinx got to their feet, a shot came from the distance and hit the truck, narrowly missing them. Zion pulled Jinx down behind the wheel well. "Guard tower has us in their sights," he said, and peeked over the truck, looking out and seeing a sniper a couple 100 yards away. He glanced over at the others, about 30 yards away, and let out a loud two-finger whistle. "Sniper!" he bellowed, pointing. Rollins looked up at the guard tower and grabbed Jarvis, dragging her down towards the tree line to get behind cover. The gunfire coming from the enemy truck was intense, the fully automatic fire shredding the other truck. The fire was never-ending, with one gunman firing and another one stepping up to take his place. As Zion tried to figure out what to do next, a high-pitched whining sound pierced the air, and he looked up as a drone hovered just above them. "There's going to be a lot more coming," he warned, and pulled his handgun at the sound of a tree branch snapping just a few yards away. He aimed and fired at a lumbering zombie, hitting it in the head. He fired a couple more times towards a few more, but his aim wasn't that good. He looked down at Jinx, who still seemed a bit foggy from the crash. "How the hell do we get out of this?" he demanded. Jinx dug in his pocket, with some difficulty. "I got you," Zion said, and moved his hand away, shoving his hand into his pocket for him, finding a grenade. "My brother," he said with a grin, and didn't hesitate, pulling the pin and popping up from behind the truck. He threw it towards the enemy truck, landing just short of it, the momentum carrying it directly underneath the vehicle. "Fire in the hole!" Zion cried, and took cover. The truck went up in a spectacular manner, the grenade detonating the gas tank. The fireball and shockwave was enough to knock the drone from the sky. "Everybody, into the woods!" Zion barked, and helped Jinx up off of the ground, pulling him quickly into the trees, firing off a few rounds at zombies as they moved. The group rushed through the woods, ghouls coming at them from all angles. They didn't have any other choice but to continue to shoot their way through them, even though they knew the noise would attract more. They took down a couple dozen creatures, the 4 soldiers leading the way, clearing the path for Zion as he dragged Jinx, who was still out of it. Finally, they reached the edge of the woods and looked out into an open area, finding the ridge that Jinx and Zion had come down earlier. "Now what?" Birch asked. "We're going to run like hell to that ridge," Zion said. "What about the shooters?" Davila asked. Zion shook his head. "Gonna have to risk it," he said. "The guy who took a shot at us was less than 100 yards away and missed, so I don't think they have their best snipers over here." "Hope you're right," Rollins warned. "Me too," Zion admitted. Before they could break from cover, more gunfire erupted behind them. "Reinforcements," Jarvis muttered. "Let's go, now!" Zion barked. He led them out from cover, the 6 of them running as hard as they could across the open area towards the barbed wire fence. They quickly jumped over it, getting to the other side and continuing to sprint towards the ridge. Upon reaching it, more gunshots hit the ground behind them. "I got this!" Davila cried, stopping at the base of the hill, turning and returning fire. The reinforcement militia were a couple 100 yards away, so nobody was particularly accurate, especially with the crosswind coming off of the ridge. Davila continued to fire as the others made their way up to the ridge. His shots weren't finding their targets, but it was doing enough to force the gunmen to take cover. "We got you! Come on!" Jarvis yelled. Davila stopped firing and started climbing as Jarvis and Rollins took shots at the militia members. They held them at bay long enough for Davila to get to the top of the hill. Everybody else retreated into the trees, staying on guard for zombies as Jarvis and Rollins held their position. They saw the militia members who were pursuing them turning their attention to the zombies their gunshots had attracted. They broke away from their position, joining the others. "They got their hands full with zombies," Jarvis said. "If we're getting away, then now's our chance." "How the hell are we getting back?" Davila asked. "We start hiking to the north," Zion said. "When we were driving down, we saw a few homes in the distance. Real ritzy types in the hills. Gotta believe there are some vehicles up there we can borrow." "That's it?" Rollins asked, throwing up his hands. "That's the plan? Maybe some vehicles at a mansion several miles away? Hey man, it's not like we had a lot of lead time to plan this rescue mission, Zion said dryly. Zion's right, Jarvis said. This is the situation we're in, and it's a fuckload better than the one we were in. Jinx staggered to his feet under his own strength, wiping some blood away from his brow. We got this, squad, he said firmly. Let's get moving. The soldiers all looked to their corporal, nodding in approval. They started walking as quickly as they could through the woods, headed towards one of the houses the duo had spotted earlier. Hey, Zion, Birch said, falling into step with the hulking man. Yeah? Zion asked. What happened to Stein? Birch asked. Zion gritted his teeth for a beat, wanting to put his thoughts into the proper words. He was a warrior until the very end, he finally said. I wouldn't be standing here if it wasn't for him. He sacrificed himself for you? Birch asked. Zion shook his head. The man stood his ground against the enemy. Took a round, he said. It happens no matter how good you are. Spent his last breath giving them the business and buying me a few seconds to get out before the room went boom. Birch nodded, and Zion went back to focusing on the terrain ahead. Several minutes of silent walking went by in the tree-covered area, until Zion held his hand up, making everyone stop. What is it? Davila asked. Zion shushed him. Listen, he whispered. The group listened hard, and a high-pitched whine grew louder in the distance. Drone! Jarvis cried, and everybody took cover, finding shadows to lie low in. They looked up, and the drone flew overhead in a scouting pattern. It coasted on by, but they remained motionless until they couldn't hear the sound anymore. We have to keep an ear out for that, Jinx said. Davila, make sure we're covering our tracks as best we can. Got you covered, Jinx, Davila promised. We gotta keep moving, the corporal urged. Come on. They picked themselves up off of the ground, moving as quickly as they could through the rough terrain, hoping that the supposed house wasn't too far away. Chapter 3. It was late afternoon, and the group had been walking for a couple of hours. It had been a solid hour since they'd last heard a drone, but they were still on high alert. They approached a large mansion from the driveway, moving up quickly towards the giant metal gate adorned with the initials DS, presumably the former owner of the property. On either side of the gate stood tall concrete privacy fencing. Jinx was a little more into things, the fog from the bump to his head having cleared up. Rollins, see if you can get us in, he instructed. On it, the private replied, and went up to the gate, pulling out a knife as he inspected the chain and motor to the automatic gate opener. He reached through, hitting the release button on the motor, making it a manual gate. Got it! Somebody give me a hand! His comrade stepped up and helped him push the gate open, enough for them to all slip through. We closing this, or leaving it open? Rollins asked. Close it, Jinx said. If patrols have been by here before now, I don't want them to know anybody has been here. The soldiers shoved the gate closed, and the corporal led them across the courtyard and up to the front door, peering inside at what was once a luxury lifestyle. Gonna go out on a limb here and say these people made more money than I did, Jinx joked. He tried the door, and it was unlocked. He motioned for the others to follow him inside, and they filed in carefully with their guns at the ready. Once inside, he motioned with his hands for everyone to fan out and clear the massive house. They broke into teams of two, some clearing the ground floor, and one team going upstairs. It took a couple of minutes for everyone to move through the expansive structure, but finally they all met again in the main foyer. We're clear, Rollins said. Upstairs is clear too, Davila added. Okay, then we hole up here for a bit, Jinx said. Shouldn't we get on the road as soon as we can? Zion asked. Jinx nodded. Yeah, but the sun doesn't have much longer in the sky, he pointed out. Figure we catch our breath and get some extra cover with the darkness. We haven't seen anything from them in the past hour, Birch reminded him. I know, Jinx said, an edge of annoyance in his tone. I'm just being extra cautious. Nothing wrong with that, Zion piped up. Calvin still has a few hours left to wait before he heads back. Okay, Davila, Birch, get in the kitchen and see what you can find, Jinx instructed. With any luck, they have a gas stove, so we might actually get a hot meal. Rollins, Jarvis, find the garage and see what kind of ride we have. Bigger the better, but make sure we have the fuel to get us back. And me? Zion asked. You and I are going to be keeping watch, Jinx said. While I think we're going to be safe, I don't want to assume anything. I'm pretty sure we pissed them off plenty, so they're not going to give us up that easily. Now, let's move. Everybody nodded and headed off to do their specific jobs. Zion patted Jinx on the shoulder, studying his face for any signs of wooziness. You hanging in there? He asked. Jinx sighed. Yeah, just that shot to the head isn't doing me any favors, he admitted. Zion looked around, spotting a big, comfy recliner sitting next to a giant window that looked out towards the driveway. He moved over and dragged it away from the center, positioning it by a wall between two windows so he had some cover. He smacked the back of it a couple of times. Go ahead and have you a seat here, Zion invited. Dr. Zion's orders. I'll take the upstairs. Jinx chuckled. Dr. Zion, huh? He drawled. Where'd you get your degree at? Buddy of mine used to sell forged documents out of the back of his pawn shop, Zion replied with a grin. $50, and I could be any kind of doctor you wanted. Jinx laughed, shaking his head, and took a seat. Okay, we report in every 10 minutes, he agreed. Will do, Zion said. Just no sleeping for you. I know this chair is comfy, but there's work to be done. Jinx just smiled and gave a thumbs up, collapsing back into the chair. He let out an exaggerated noise of comfort as he hit the leather. Zion turned and headed upstairs, looking around. He found a side bedroom to take the first shift in, walking in and opening up the blinds slightly to look out. The vantage point allowed him to see down the driveway and overlooked the wilderness area they'd come through. Zion studied the horizon, trying to see if there was any movement. He couldn't find any. Stay focused, he thought to himself. They're out there. If they have any sense, they'll stay out there. He pulled over a padded seat from in front of the closet, plopping down on it and retaking his position in front of the window. He sighed. I really should have picked the recliner. Chapter 4. An hour had passed since the group made it to the house. Zion continued staring out the window, even though the sun had set, and the moonlight wasn't doing much in the way of lighting things up. He started slightly as Jarvis entered the room, knocking lightly on the door. I'm sorry, she said softly. Did I scare you? Zion shook his head, playfully puffing out his chest. Me? Scared? He joked. Nah, you just broke my steely gaze out the window unexpectedly. Jarvis chuckled. We'll go with startle then, she said. He motioned for her to come in, and she carried over a serving tray with piping hot soup and some bread. Got some dinner if you're interested, she said, sitting the tray on the nearby table. He perked up, nodding excitedly. What's on the menu? He asked. Well, we have some canned soup with veggies and something resembling meat, Jarvis replied, and some overly processed bread that went stale a couple weeks ago, but didn't have any mold, so they baked it a little. Edible? Zion asked. She shrugged. Depends on your definition of the word edible, she replied. If you let it soak in the soup for a minute or two, it's not bad. If you don't do that, I'm pretty sure you could file it down and it would be strong enough to take out a zombie brain. Zion laughed and picked up the piece of bread, dropping it into the soup bowl. "How's everybody doing down there?" he asked as he stirred the soup with his spoon. "About as well as one can expect," she said with a sigh. "We're battered, some worse than others, but we're strong." "And I would assume pissed," Zion said. She nodded, crossing her arms and taking up position at the window so he could eat. "We're good at bottling that up," she said. "Sadly, it's not the first time we've lost someone. Seriously doubt it will be the last time." "How are you doing?" Zion asked as he blew on the soup. "Like I said, we're strong," she said, almost defensively. "I'm strong." Her arms tightened as if to cover the bloodstains still dotting her body from her wounds. Somebody had patched her up downstairs, and he could see bandages peeking out from the hems of her clothes. He nodded. "You're stronger than I am," he said, and put a tentative spoonful into his mouth, not wanting to burn himself. She shook her head and huffed something that almost sounded like a laugh. "I doubt that," she said. He shrugged. "You saw what I did when one of my men was cut down," he reminded her. She paused, remembering Burris's group, and gave a solemn and silent nod. He and Calvin had single-handedly wiped out almost the entire squad. "And for the record," Zion continued, "after what you, Jinx, and the others have done for me, Stein was 100% one of my men. I know we're on the run now, but you can bet your bottom dollar I ain't gonna forget what they did to him." She smiled softly. "Jinx will appreciate that sentiment," she said. "I know I do." She briefly gazed at him, and he allowed himself to enjoy the sweetness of her eyes, for a moment, before she turned back to the window. Life was too short in the apocalypse to not take advantage of such things. "This thing is far from over," Zion continued, shaking his head. "And I got a long memory." Jarvis stiffened, staring out the window. "You're right. It's far from over," she said. He set down his bowl and joined her at the window, looking out into the darkness. "What do you see?" he asked, not finding what had spooked her. 5 o'clock, she said, pointing. Zion followed her direction, staring at a small patch of land with a few trees. It was still difficult to see anything in the dim. "I'm sorry, I'm not seeing it," he admitted. "They're out there. Just keep looking," she urged. He stared at the area and finally spotted a glint of moonlight off of something metal, likely a weapon. Then more glints, and as his eyes adjusted, he realized there were 6 men coming up the path towards the driveway. "Go tell them they're coming," he said. "I'll keep an eye on them." Jarvis nodded and took off for downstairs. Zion continued watching the militia men as they moved quickly through the darkness, before vanishing behind the wall. He waited several minutes, making sure they weren't hopping over it. When he was satisfied that they were staying put, he ran out of the room and down the hall to the front bedroom. He darted around the king-sized bed and to the window, carefully peeling back the blinds just enough to look at the front gate. It took several moments for the squad to appear, and they stood there, peering through the bars. One of them pulled out a pair of binoculars, scanning the house. Zion assumed that they were night vision, so he moved back from the window, making it virtually impossible for him to be spotted. "You don't see anything here," he murmured under his breath. "Keep moving down the road." He tried to will them away, continuing to watch them as they appeared to debate what to do. His wishes went unanswered as the squad went to work on the front gate. One of them reached inside, clicking the release mechanism on the gate and pushing it open. "Shit," Zion muttered, freezing in place. "Okay, they're not starting on the second floor," he thought, as his mind reeled over what to do. "So if Jinx starts some shit, I'm going to be the wild card." He nodded to himself, getting psyched up, until something dawned on him. Damn, what if they don't start anything? There are plenty of places to hide down there. He looked around, trying to figure out the best place to hide. Finally, he spotted the master bedroom closet, which had a double set of doors. He ran over to it, threw it open, and took a moment to look at it. The closet was a giant 10-foot by 15-foot room, with rows and rows of clothes, as well as a built-in wooden shoe holder in the middle. Zion shook his head in disgust. Shit, man. My first apartment was smaller than this, he thought bitterly. Rich people, I swear. He went inside, shutting the door behind him, pulling out a small flashlight to figure out where he needed to go. He looked to the far side of the shoe case, which would provide him with some cover. Before ducking down, he looked over and saw a stretch of long formal dresses. He grabbed them and hung them over his hiding spot before ducking down. While it wasn't perfect, it gave him some cover. He clicked off the flashlight, pulling out a knife and getting it in the ready position as he crouched down, trying to hide his massive frame behind the case. Zion held his breath, because the only thing he could do was listen and hope that all he heard was footsteps. A minute went by before there was a sound, a window shattering. This was quickly followed by the muffled sound of someone yelling. Door was open, dumbass, Zion thought. He remained silent and still, listening intently, which was difficult from his position in the closet. It took a couple of minutes before he heard footsteps coming up the stairs and made out 2 sets of them. 2 of them, okay, that's manageable, he thought. Probably going to be one at a time. Neck shot and move, neck shot and move. He shook that out of his head, going back to hoping for no confrontation at all. He continued to listen as doors down the hallway opened and closed, some harder than others. There was light chatter between the 2 militiamen, but he couldn't make it out. If they're talking that loudly, they must assume there's nobody in here, Zion thought, and continued to stay silent, and in the ready position as the master bedroom door creaked open. 2 sets of footsteps walked in, much more casually than he would have expected. Small beams of light pierced through the bottom of the closet doors, but he didn't become concerned until the light focused and stayed there. Okay, here we go, Zion thought, listening as the footsteps grew closer and closer. The door opened and light flooded into the closet. Man, get a load of this, one of the men said, letting out a long whistle. Zion stayed as still as he could, tensely hoping that the gunman wasn't talking about him. Christ, this closet is bigger than my first apartment, the second man quipped, and Zion couldn't help but smirk a little at the identical comment to his own thoughts. Judging by the clothes, I'd say it's worth more than your first apartment too, the first guy joked. Zion heard a light smack, and then the lights turned away from the closet. Come on, let's go report in, the second man said. There's nobody here. How many more of these houses do we have to check? The first one whined. Those murdering assholes are long gone. There's a couple more up here, but I think we're calling it after that, came the reply. The voices faded as they walked out of the bedroom, slamming the door behind them. Zion let out a deep sigh of relief, collapsing in a seated position, knowing that they dodged a huge bullet. He sat there for several minutes, not daring to get up until someone came to get him. It didn't take much longer before Jarvis entered the bedroom. "Zion, are you in here?" she whispered. "It's Jarvis." He got up from the closet and walked towards her. "Yeah, I'm here," he said. "We good?" She smiled at him. "Yeah, they left several minutes ago," she said. "Got Birch and Rollins keeping watch. They sent me to get you so we can get the hell out of here." Zion shook his head. "We need to lay low for another hour," he said. Her brow furrowed in confusion. "Why?" she asked. "Overheard the 2 who came up here talking," he explained. "Said they had a few more houses to clear before they called it. As long as we stay out of sight and quiet, we should be on our own soon enough."
"Okay, I'll go let Jinx know," Jarvis replied. "You want to keep watch up here?"
He nodded. "I'll take care of it." She nodded and left, and Zion walked back over to the window, peeking out from behind the blinds. There was no movement, much to his relief. "You're good, man, you're good," he thought. "Clear sailing from here on out." He repeated it a few times, trying to convince himself it was true. Chapter 5. Zion sat behind the wheel of a massive SUV, with everybody packed inside. The drive had been silent, with the occasional snoring from a few exhausted soldiers in the back breaking the silence. Zion looked in the rearview mirror, seeing that everybody in the back was sound asleep, heads resting on shoulders and on the side of the door. The only people awake were him and Jinx, who was in the front seat with him. "How much further we got?" Jinx asked. Zion tilted his head back and forth. "Couple of miles," he said. "Okay, when we get there, you let me do all the talking," Jinx replied. "You expecting trouble?" Zion asked. Jinx nodded. "If we don't play it right, yeah, could be trouble," he said. "Captain Hardass?" Zion drawled. The corporal sighed. "Yep," he said. "Should I just be dropping you guys off short of town and letting you walk in?" Zion suggested. Jinx shook his head. "No," he replied. "We have a much bigger issue than what happened at the apartment complex the other day. I just need to get to Captain Odom and get him on the right page." "Oh, shit," Zion muttered. "What?" Jinx asked. "What if Calvin went back early?" Zion wondered. "Worst case is they'll just keep him in holding," the corporal assured him. "If he's there, I'll get him out." Zion nodded as he continued to drive, then took a deep breath. "How pissed at you is Captain Hardass going to be?" he asked. "For what?" Jinx asked. "Essentially starting a war," Zion replied. The corporal sat and thought for a moment, letting the statement wash over him. The gravity of the situation settled into his bones, because this hadn't even occurred to him. I didn't even consider that," he admitted. "I just knew my squad was in trouble, and I wasn't going home without them." Zion shrugged. "I mean, if you want to get technical, they're the ones that started it," he said. Jinx perked up, snapping his fingers and pointing at him. "Exactly," he exclaimed. "I didn't start it, but I sure as hell finished it." He flopped back in his seat, shaking his head. "Well, I didn't exactly finish it, more like drove a tanker truck full of gas into a wildfire, but you know what I mean." "It's funny. I could have lived to be 1,000 in the normal world and our paths would never have crossed," Zion said with a chuckle. "Let alone us becoming friends." "The apocalypse is a funny place, man," Jinx agreed. "Got that right," Zion said with a nod. "First, I got a countrified sniper in Calvin by my side. Now I got your crazy ass blowing up hospitals and starting wars and shit." They started laughing, sharing a brief moment of levity that slowly faded as white salmon came into view ahead. As they crested the hill, bright lights hit the vehicle, and several armed civilians and military came around the barricade, spreading out and motioning for them to stop. Zion hit the brakes, stopping about 50 yards short of the barricade, waking up the soldiers in the back. "Huh?" Birch asked sleepily. "What's going on?" "We home?" Davila groaned. "Yeah, and they got the welcoming committee out for us," Zion said. "Everybody stay in the SUV," Jinx instructed. "I'll let you know when it's safe." The corporal got out, immediately raising his hands and walking forward. "You stay right there until we tell you otherwise," one of the guards yelled. "My name is Corporal Jinx," Jinx said, keeping his hands high. "I need you to get me Sergeant Dickerson or Captain Odom." "Not until we figure out who you are," the guard barked back. "Hey, dumbass, I just told you who I am," Jinx snapped.
Corporal Jinx, he repeated with exaggerated slowness. Get Sergeant Dickerson or Captain Odom down here now. We have a shit show on our hands. Two of the civilian guards looked at him before looking at each other. They still didn't seem to know what to do, and Jinx growled in frustration, walking towards the barricade, hands still in the air. "Stay right there!" the guard shrieked. "Is there anybody military here?" Jinx bellowed. One of the guards to the left raised his hand. "I'm Corporal Jinx. You know who I am?" Jinx asked. "Yes, I do," the soldier replied firmly. "Good," the corporal huffed, lowering his hands. "Tell these assholes so we can get on the other side of the barricade, then go get Sergeant Dickerson and Captain Odom. They are still in town, aren't they?" "Yes, they are," the soldier replied. "Great! Time's a factor, Bubba," Jinx urged. "Let's get a move on." The soldier nodded, motioning to the other guards to let the SUV through. "Tell them to park over there while I get them on the line," he said. "Appreciate it," Jinx said. Zion drove inside the barricade and Jinx motioned for him to park over to the side. The group got out of the SUV as the soldier called it in. "We good?" Zion asked. "Well, they didn't shoot me, so I'd say that's a step in the right direction," Jinx said. They looked over to the soldier, who was talking on a walkie-talkie, but he was too far away from them to hear. He eventually put it down and began walking towards the group, his hand on his sidearm. "Corporal, you and your team are cleared to go up to City Hall," the soldier called. "Captain Odom and Sergeant Dickerson will meet you there." "Great, let's roll out," Jinx said. The hammer on the handgun clicked back, causing everybody to freeze in place. "I'm sorry, Corporal. Only your group is clear to go," he said firmly. "I'm under orders to take this man into custody." Jinx looked at Zion, giving him a slight nod before stepping in front of him. "Soldier, we have much bigger fish to fry than Zion," he said. "He's on our side, and believe me when I say that we need him right now." "But Captain Odom," the soldier began. "Captain Odom doesn't have all the relevant information," Jinx interrupted. "Look at my team. They're bloody, cut up, and not that you would know this, but I'm missing one. And it's not because he got lost. You understand?" The soldier let go of his handgun, nodding slowly. "Yes, Corporal," he said. "I'll take responsibility for Zion," Jinx promised. "In the meantime, I want you to lock this barricade down, reinforce it with whatever you can find. Cars, scrap metal, and get more guns up here. Nobody comes in or out until you hear from me. Is that understood?" The soldier swallowed at the intensity in the corporal's voice and nodded vehemently. "Yes, I'll make it happen," he said. "Good," Jinx replied, but with one more glance at Zion, he snapped his fingers. "Oh, shit. Wait," he said, turning back around. "Has a good old country boy named Calvin come through here yet?" "Yes, Corporal, about an hour ago," the soldier replied. "Where is he?" Jinx asked. "In lockup," the soldier replied. "Okay, get back on the line and tell Dickerson and Odom that we'll meet them at the lockup," Jinx said. The soldier sighed. "But Corporal, do it now!" Jinx snapped, all good faith gone from his voice. The soldier nodded and ran back to the walkie-talkie as he motioned to his crew to come over for a briefing. Jinx led his group back to the SUV. "Come on, Calvin's here and he's safe," he said. "We just gotta get him out of jail." Chapter 6. Zion drove quickly towards the lockup, slamming on the brakes just short of it. Jinx got out faster than Zion did, even though the latter was a lot more pissed off at the treatment of his friend than Jinx was. The corporal marched right up to a couple of military guards, who got defensive at the fuming soldier. "Move! Now!" he snapped. "I can't do that, sir," one of the guards replied shakily. Jinx stopped, pointing directly in his face, just an inch away from his nose, speaking in a tone that would make any breathing human quake. "Move, or I will move you,"
he said lethally. The guards tensed at his tone and face, but before the situation could escalate, someone approached from behind.
"Calm down, Jinx,"
Sergeant Dickerson said. Jinx whirled around to face him. "Dickerson, thank God," he huffed. "Calvin needs to be let out right now." The sergeant shook his head.
"Captain Odom ordered him locked up," he said.
"I don't give a good goddamn what he ordered," Jinx snapped. "He needs to be out now."
"Is that a fact, Corporal?"
Odom asked from the doorway of the lockup, with Sergeant Burris standing smugly behind him. "Yes, sir, it is a fact," Jinx replied firmly. "We wouldn't be standing here without Calvin, sir."
"Well, my men would be standing here if it wasn't for that murdering son of a bitch,"
Burris snarled, pointing at Zion.
"Him too! Somebody arrest him!"
The guards took a step forward, but Jinx stood his ground, shaking his head. "Do not take one more step," he said.
"Stand down, Corporal,"
Burris barked.
"You're lucky I'm not telling them to arrest you too."
Rage rose in Jinx at that, and he shoved his way past the guards and made a beeline for Burris. Captain Odom threw his arm out, shoving back on his chest.
"That's enough, out of all of you," he yelled. "Clearly there are some things we need to hammer out."
He glanced at the squad.
"Davila, Birch, take Zion to the restaurant across the street. Don't let him out of your sight."
"Zion needs to stay with us," Jinx demanded. Odom shook his head, looking almost disappointed.
"You're pushing your luck, Jinx," he warned.
"Captain, he's the leader of his settlement," Jinx argued. "He needs to be involved in this discussion." The anger in his eyes faded, and he stared at his superior, urging him with his eyes. "Captain, have I ever not been a straight shooter with you?" he asked. The captain thought for a moment, then sighed.
"Okay, he can come in," he finally said.
"Calvin stays locked up until we hammer this out. Not up for debate."
"I'm good with that," Jinx said. "Zion?"
"I can live with it," Zion said.
"Let's go inside then," Odom said.
"I need something first," Zion said, stopping them in their tracks.
"Son, you're in no position to be asking for things," the captain warned.
"Carrie and Matthew," Zion said, and Jinx nodded, nearly smacking his forehead for not thinking of it sooner. "Davila, take the team and coordinate with some of the local guards," the corporal ordered. "Find those two and bring them here, restrained." "On it," Davila said, and the privates headed off.
"What the hell is all that about?"
Odom snapped. "Spies," Jinx replied. The captain's eyes nearly bugged out of his head.
"Spies?" he huffed. "What the hell are you talking about?"
Jinx sighed and waved towards the door. "Let's get inside, and I'll lay it all out for you," he said. Chapter 7. Jinx wrapped up his briefing of the last 48 hours. Burris and Dickerson stood there listening, not moving a muscle, as Captain Odom rubbed the bridge of his nose while shaking his head with exhaustion.
"So, let me get this straight," he said once the corporal was done. "You blew up a hospital in downtown Portland before fleeing this little settlement, making contact with a militia that claims to have multiple armies across the region, and you started a war with them."
Jinx shrugged. "In a nutshell, yeah," he said.
"I swear to God, Jinx, you're going to give me an ulcer,"
Odom groaned. "Captain, he never fired first," Zion said. "He just did what he had to in order to protect his men." Odom sighed.
"I understand that, son," he said, "but it doesn't change the fact that he's kicked up one hell of a hornet's nest."
"Be that as it may, Captain, we need to get Calvin out of lockup immediately," Jinx said firmly.
"Hell no!"
Burris barked, breaking his silence.
"He killed several of my men."
"In self-defense," Jinx snapped. "I lost a good man today, Stein, because of you. Because you couldn't keep it in your pants." Burris opened his mouth to argue, but Jinx pointed a finger at him. "Shut your goddamn mouth," the corporal snarled. "I don't have time to deal with you. We have bigger issues at the moment. But your day will come." Burris wrinkled his nose and slinked back against the wall, crossing his arms. "Sir, we need Calvin out and on that line," Jinx said, turning back to the captain. "He's one of the best shooters I've ever seen." Given the circumstances, Odom sighed and nodded. "Sergeant Dickerson?" he said. "Yes, sir," Dickerson asked. "Free Calvin. Get him whatever he needs and put him on the wall," Odom instructed. "Yes, sir," the sergeant replied. "Have one of the guards drive him down," Odom added. "I'm going to need you in here." Dickerson nodded and headed off as Odom turned back to the group. "Zion, does this town have a ham radio?" he asked. "Yes, we do," Zion replied. "It's in City Hall." "That's where we're moving," the captain replied. "I need to get Seattle on the line." Zion nodded and motioned for them to follow. As they walked out of the room, Calvin emerged from lockup, and his eyes lit up. He ran over and threw his arms around the big guy. "Oh my God, you're alive!" he cried. "Are you for real right now?" Zion asked dryly. Calvin let go, backing up, a blush of embarrassment creeping up his cheeks. "Sorry, it's just, things went bad," he said. "I heard so much gunfire, so much on the radio. I didn't think—" "Well, we made it," Zion said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Now go grab your gun and get on that southern wall. Any of those bastards comes our way, you shoot them in the ass." Calvin nodded before giving Jinx a relieved smile and running off with the guards. It took the group a few minutes to get over to City Hall and get set up, with Odom at the controls, dialing up Seattle. Seattle base, come back," the captain said. "This is Seattle base," a soldier replied. "Please identify." "This is Captain Odom," he said. "Priority request for Corporal Gadd or Clint Rensfold." "Stand by," the soldier replied. "Jinx, this is going to be your show," Odom said while they waited. "Tell them everything you told me, and I'll jump in." "You got it, Captain," Jinx said. Several tense moments went by before the line came back. "Captain Odom, you have Clint and Gadd here," Clint said. "Where are you?" "Down here in White Salmon, about 50-60 miles to the east of Portland along the river," Odom explained. "We got a situation brewing down here." "Enlighten us," Gadd invited. "I'm turning you over to my man on the ground, Corporal Jinx," Odom said, sliding over and allowing Jinx to move in front of the microphone. "Gentlemen, good to talk to you," Jinx said. "What you got for us, Corporal?" Clint asked. "Approximately 48 hours ago, some troops of ours made contact with the survivors here in White Salmon," Jinx began. "Things went south due to some incompetence on the part of the sergeant in charge." Burris bristled but stayed silent as Odom glared at him. "At which point my team was activated," Jinx continued. "Upon arriving, we determined that the leader of this camp, Zion, and one of his men were not responsible for the tragic loss of life. Given the situation, I decided the best course of action was to head south for a little while in order to calm tensions and get everybody on the same page." "With all due respect, Corporal, this doesn't exactly sound like a situation that requires us," Clint cut in. "This next part does," Jinx said. "Upon going south, we made contact with a group of people clearing out the town of Redmond. It was during this operation that my team was kidnapped and taken to Bend. Upon interrogating a prisoner, we discovered that there is a massive militia force located in Bend." "How massive are we talking?" Gadd asked. "While I have no confirmed numbers, it's easily in the thousands and potentially in the tens of thousands," Jinx said. "Jesus," Clint breathed. "And according to multiple sources, they have armies all over the region," the corporal continued. "Again, I do not have confirmation about this, but based on their setup in Bend, it's very probable that this is the case." "Okay. First things first," Gadd cut in. "We need to figure out how to treat the hostage situation in Bend. Clint, I need you to— excuse me, Corporal,"
Jinx said. Yes, Gad replied. Zion and I already resolved the hostage situation, Jinx said slowly. The line went very silent for a few tense moments, before Clint asked, How hard did you kick that hornet's nest, Corporal? They hunted us for hours after we fled, Jinx replied. Okay, Clint huffed with a sigh. What's done is done. Were you able to retrieve your team? One KIA, and several who were going to need some medical attention, Jinx said. I'm sure you did what you thought was best, Corporal, but you've put us in a hell of a position, Gad said, sounding as tired as Odom did. If it's any consolation, they already hate the military for abandoning them, Jinx quipped. Can't say I fully blame them either. You sympathetic to their cause, Corporal? Clint asked. Jinx growled. They killed one of my men, he snapped. Before this is done, I will burn their entire organization to the ground. So no, I'm not sympathetic to their cause. However, I understand their position. Do they have active military within their ranks? Gad asked. Unconfirmed, but most likely, yeah, Jinx replied. Thank you for your report, Corporal, Gad said. Captain Odom, Clint continued. I'm here, Odom said, sliding back into place. What's your force strength in white salmon? Clint asked. Odom shook his head. Skeleton crew, he admitted. Maybe 15 bodies? In your opinion, do you think this town is defendable against an assault? Clint asked. The captain took a deep breath. With some reinforcements and some work, yes. I think we can turn this into a fortress that would give anybody trouble, he said. Okay, Clint said. I want you to begin immediately. Excuse the fuck out of me, Zion snapped. But y'all ain't doing a goddamn thing without consulting me first. The line went completely quiet, the level of tension in the room rising in everyone's bodies except for Jinx, who lounged in his chair with a smirk. You must be Zion, Clint finally said. Zion scoffed. What gave it away? He drawled. First off, you have my sincere apology for how our first encounter went, Clint began. You think this was our first encounter? Zion asked, throwing up his hands. You dumbasses messed up when you were dropping bombs on my people. Not only did we lose people we loved, but we lost our homes, too. Sergeant Dumbass and his merry band of trigger-happy assholes was just the latest kick in the teeth from you people. He pointed a finger at the corporal, despite the people on the radio not being able to see it. If it wasn't for Jinx here, I'd swear every last one of you was brain-dead, and I'd be taking up arms with those militia assholes down in Bend. Now, before you speak, I want you to be very, very careful with the words that come out of your mouth. Because despite my love for Jinx and his crew, it is not a foregone conclusion that I'm on your side. The line was silent for a moment, until Clint took a deep breath, speaking slowly and carefully. Okay, Zion, first off, please allow me to properly introduce myself, he said. My name is Clint Rensfold, and my partner here is Corporal Gad. We are the right-hand men to General Stevens, who is in charge of the operation here in Seattle. Let me assure you that if we make you a deal, our word is true. Corporal Jinx there can confirm that we are on the up and up. Zion glanced at the corporal. This true? He asked. Jinx nodded. Yep, he said easily. If they say they'll get you something, consider it done. Okay, Clint, Zion said, turning back to the radio. Keep talking. Zion, I want you to tell me, Clint said. What do you and your community need? I don't have a full list in front of me, but off the top of my head we need food and medicine, Zion said. We're set up okay at the moment, but the longer this winter goes, the more problematic it's going to become. Okay, I can have a shipment of food down to you within 48 hours, Clint promised. Medication is going to be a little more difficult to come by at the moment, but I will make sure there is something of value in there for you. Now, what else can I get for you? Zion crossed his arms. My next two biggest items are gas and bullets, he said. I'll be honest with you. Both of those commodities are in extremely short supply up here, Clint said slowly. At the moment, we have none to spare. However, Zion leaned in. I'm listening, he said. We are working on the issue, Clint replied. We have a pipeline that is opening back up, and we are working to get one of the refineries back online. But it's taking time. And bullets? Zion asked. Those too. However, we do have some major issues with that, Clint replied. What issues? Captain Odom cut in, then raised his hand in apology. Sorry to interrupt, Zion. It's all good, the bigger man replied. That was my question too. Okay, what I'm about to tell you is not common knowledge, Clint warned. We are keeping this on a need-to-know basis because we do not want to cause panic here. But Jinx, the information you have about the militia group having multiple armies is accurate. An eerie, uncomfortable silence fell over the room before Jinx leaned forward in his seat. How bad is it? He asked, voice low. Really bad, Clint said. We've already had multiple contacts with them, some as far away as Boise. Boise? Odom barked. They have a bigger territory than we do. And by all accounts, they're hostile to us, Clint continued. I don't say this lightly, but there's a war coming, and despite our best efforts, I don't see a way that it can be avoided. While that sentiment isn't shared by everybody up here who is in the know, it is the general consensus. Jesus, Odom breathed. So, Zion, with everything you know, and with everything I've offered you, Clint finally said, are you on board with us? Zion raised a finger. I have one more condition, he said. Name it, Clint replied. Sergeant Burris needs to be disciplined for his actions, Zion said. Now wait a damn minute, Burris roared. Stand down, Sergeant, Odom snapped. That's an order. He was upset, seething and glaring at Zion, but did as he was told. Normally in situations like this, we would have a formal investigation and a trial, Clint said. However, given the situation, I'm going to leave it up to you and Captain Odom. Captain, am I correct in assuming you know the full story? Yes, Clint, Odom replied with a nod. I have eyewitness accounts from people on both sides. Okay, Zion, what would you like to see done? Clint asked. Zion cocked his head, thinking for a moment, glaring at Burris, who looked more and more concerned for his fate. This man is responsible for the death of my friend Mateo, he finally said. Mateo was a good man, who risked his life in order to save others, a man who helped build this community up to what it is today. And while the sergeant isn't the one who pulled the trigger, it was his leadership, or lack thereof, that led to my friend's death. Zion paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. You know, back in my enforcer days, I would just take him out back and whoop his ass so bad that he'd spend the next month in the ICU. Unfortunately, I don't have that luxury anymore, because if I did that, he'd never recover. We do have jails, Odom reminded him. Zion shook his head. Nah, that's too easy, he said, and looked up at the ceiling. He'd just get to sit around on his fat ass getting waited on hand and foot. That would be rewarding him for his incompetence. I have a better idea. Odom sighed. Name it, he said. I want him stripped of his rank, Zion said. Bust his ass down to private and put him in the hardest working group out here, so long as it's far away from here. You can't do that, Burris snapped. But we can, Odom said calmly. Captain! Burris cried, whirling to face his superior with wide eyes. You may not have pulled the trigger, but your team caused this through a lack of discipline. Sergeant Dickerson. Sir? Dickerson asked. Take Private Burris outside, Odom said. Yes, sir, Dickerson replied, and grabbed Burris by the arm, dragging him from the building as he spat, cursed, and yelled, mostly aimed at Jinx. Are you satisfied, Zion? Clint asked. Yeah, I'm on board,
But I do have one more small request, Zion said. I want Jinx and his team to be stationed here. Clint paused. I can't promise that will always be the case, but I will make sure he's there while we get your community set up to be properly defended, he said. Good enough? Good enough, Zion replied. So what's our next move, Clint? Odom asked, leaning forward. I'll have a convoy sent down to you within 24 hours, Clint replied. It'll have the goods I promised Zion, and a detachment of troops to start reinforcing the camp. We can reconvene in 48 hours and figure out where to go from there. Jinx glanced outside, spotting Davila near the window. He motioned to his right, and Jinx leaned over to see his team standing there, with a restrained Carrie and Matthew. Clint, might have something here, he said. What is it? Came the reply. The entire reason we ended up heading towards Bend was thanks to a couple of newcomers in the community here, the corporal explained as he got to his feet. Turns out they were recruiters, or spies, or whatever you want to call them. Apparently they weren't smart enough to flee once they sent us that way. My team just caught them. Does the militia in Bend have any more of our people? Clint asked. No, Jinx replied. Okay, I want you to set them free, Clint instructed. Jinx's eyes widened, and he whirled on the radio as if it had personally attacked him. What? He snapped. Are you fucking kidding me? I'm deadly serious, Corporal, Clint said firmly. Free them, but send them on their way with a message. Tell them to tell their leaders that we want to talk. Neutral site, no preconditions. But we want to talk and see if more bloodshed can be avoided. Do you really think they're going to go for that? Jinx demanded. Realistically, I figure they're going to do the same thing we're going to do, Clint replied. Feel us out to see what kind of force strength we have. All I care about is buying us some time to shore up defenses there. So tell them that we want to meet a week from now. That will give us time to get reinforcements down there and hopefully let them cool off from the damage you caused. Jinx sighed. Hey, they started it, he said lamely. No judgment, Clint quipped. Just a statement of fact. All right then, Jinx conceded. We'll take care of it, Clint, Odom said. Touch base in 48. Copy that, Clint said. And the line went dead. Zion crossed his arms. So what are we really going to do with those two? He asked. We're going to do as we're ordered, the captain snapped. Not asking you, Zion said. Jinx? The corporal sighed. We're going to do as ordered, he said slowly. But after I have a chat with them. He turned on his heel and marched outside, the other two following close behind. As soon as Jinx emerged, Carrie and Matthew shrunk away from the sight of him. Jinx didn't speak, simply stalked up to them, stopping just short of Matthew, who immediately went on the defensive. Look, man, it was nothing personal, he stammered. I was just doing as ordered. Just following orders, huh? Jinx snarled. You know that's not a particularly great defense there. Matthew clammed up a bit, and the corporal moved over to Carrie, leaning forward so he was eye to eye with her quivering face. So what's your excuse? Jinx asked, voice deadly. Matthew babbled. Leave her alone. He choked off his words with a whine as Jinx pulled his handgun, pointing it towards his face, and cocking the hammer back. For added effect, he moved it forward a little more, all while never breaking eye contact with Carrie, until the tip of the barrel pressed against Matthew's forehead. Interrupting is rude, Jinx said flatly. Nod if you understand. Matthew nodded silently, looking like he was concentrating on not wetting himself. Now, where were we? Jinx continued. Oh yes. What's your excuse? Carrie seemed less scared, staring him down defiantly. Because we're at war, and sometimes that requires risking your life for your cause, she said firmly. And what cause is that? Jinx demanded. Freedom, she snapped. You abandoned us. America abandoned us. So, as far as we're concerned,
This territory is ours. We fought for it, sacrificed for it, and pulled it back from the brink. Now you think you can just waltz in here like nothing happened and reclaim it?" She shook her head, baring her teeth. "Never going to happen. You're not liberators. You're an invading army." "I'm sorry you feel that way," Jinx said, "because we're not going anywhere." "And you think we are?" Carrie shot back with a smirk. "You have no idea what we're capable of." "I blew up a hospital yesterday, so pretty sure the same sentiment applies to me as well," Jinx replied with a wink. She blinked at him in shock, but schooled her expression. "Be that as it may, you're not going to get anything from me," she declared. "Lock me up, torture me. I'm not going to tell you shit." "Oh, I know," Jinx drawled. "You're not going to tell us anything because you don't know anything. I mean, do you really think your leaders would be so irresponsible to send someone with intimate knowledge of their operation out into the wild? Of course not. Hell, I'd be surprised if you even knew who your leaders were." She wrinkled her nose with distaste, but he knew he'd struck home because she didn't argue. "So, what are you going to do with us?" she asked instead. "I'm going to set you free," Jinx replied, and held up a finger. "But there is a condition for your release." "Oh yeah?" Carrie demanded. "What?" "You're going to take a message back to your leaders," Jinx said. "Tell them that we want to meet and discuss the situation." She rolled her eyes. "I can save you the trouble. They'll never go for it," she drawled. "I have a feeling that they will," Jinx assured her. "So this is what you're going to tell them. 1 week from today, 12 noon, the barbecue joint north of Redmond. The very same one you sent us to. Now you're going to deliver that message for me, aren't you?" She stared him down for a beat and then nodded in agreement. "Good girl," Jinx said, patting her head condescendingly. "Also, a couple more things. Tell them there's a strict cap on the delegation size. No more than 5 people within a mile of that restaurant." Carrie jutted out her chin. "Or what?" she challenged. He leaned in close, lowering his voice to his low and lethal tone. "We will have an entire battalion of troops a mile up the road decked out and ready for war," he said. "Only they won't have to do much outside of mop-up duty, because we will rain tomahawk missiles down on Bend." "You would kill civilians?" Carrie scoffed. "Me?" Jinx asked, motioning to himself with his handgun and shaking his head. "No. The higher-ups who are bound and determined to protect Seattle at all costs, however, will do whatever they need to do in a heartbeat. So please share that information with your leaders." Carrie swallowed hard beneath his firm gaze. "Okay," she finally said. "But how are we getting there?" "Depends," Jinx replied with a shrug. "How did you get here?" "We drove," Matthew said flatly. "Good," Jinx said, and without any warning, fired a bullet into Matthew's knee. He fell to the ground, screaming obscenities, and Captain Odom exploded. "Corporal!" he cried, staring in shock at what Jinx had done. Jinx ignored him, staring down Carrie. "One of my men is dead because of you," he said, and his voice finally made her quiver beneath it. "And with every step he takes, he's going to remember that he caused that. Now if I ever see you again, you're going to wish you were as well off as him." Zion stepped up and pulled Jinx back. The corporal allowed it, but he stared down Carrie as he went. She broke eye contact first, looking at the ground, and only then did Jinx tap Zion to let up, falling into step beside him. "Get them their car and enough fuel to get to Bend," Zion instructed some of his people nearby. "Then make sure they leave. If they refuse, pop another kneecap." 2 men nodded and headed off with Carrie and Matthew, the latter hissing and moaning as he dragged his wounded leg behind him. Jinx began to walk away, but Odom stepped into his path, face near purple with rage. "You want to tell me what in the holy hell that was?" he demanded. "You just risked everything to what? Hurt somebody?" "Nobody is going to care he has a bullet in his knee," Jinx drawled, waving him off. "How in the hell do you know that?" the captain cried. "Just because you want it to be true doesn't make it so." "He's the second in command in a two-person scouting mission," Jinx said. "I could have put a bullet in his brain and it wouldn't have changed anything. Plus, I wanted to put that extra little fear of God into them." "Bullshit, Corporal! You wanted revenge for Stein," Odom snapped. Jinx shrugged. "Maybe," he admitted. Odom took a deep breath, pinching the bridge of his nose and collecting himself. "Until I get reassigned, you are not allowed to shoot anybody unless they are shooting you first. Do you understand, Corporal?" he asked firmly. "Yes, sir," Jinx replied. "Go get some rest," the captain said, waving him away. "Find me at dawn, and I'll have orders for you." "Yes, sir," Jinx replied. Odom shook his head, muttering under his breath as he walked away. Zion approached, reaching out to take Jinx's shoulder. "You good, brother?" he asked. "Yeah, just got chewed out a little," Jinx replied with a smile. "Totally worth it." "I agree," Zion said with a laugh. "Pretty sure you made that boy piss himself." "My apologies to your men who have to deal with them," Jinx said. "They've dealt with worse," Zion admitted. Jinx smirked. "Still, I'll loot them something nice the next time I'm out," he said. "So, what does he want you to do now?" Zion asked. "Rest until dawn," Jinx said. Zion nodded and jerked a thumb over his shoulder. "Meet me at the bridge in 10 minutes, he said. "I can do that," the corporal agreed. Zion nodded and jogged off, and Jinx stood there for a beat, confused, but he trusted his friend. He turned and started hiking towards the bridge. His walk was quiet, strolling along the road and looking around at the mostly empty streets. The stars above were bright and plentiful, with virtually no light pollution to block them out. He made it to the bridge and walked towards the middle so he could see the river. The river below flowed mightily, the moon reflecting off of it. It was chilly out, but his blood still ran hot from the day, and it was difficult to quiet it. Several minutes later, footsteps echoed, and he glanced over to see Zion approaching with a small cooler. "Sorry, took me a little longer than I thought," the large man said. Jinx shook his head. "No worries. Gave me time to enjoy my peacefulness," he said. "Yeah, it was a bit of a culture shock when I got out here," Zion admitted. "Going from the inner city to Portland was bad enough, but out here to the nothingness? Never had anything like this in my life." He set down the cooler and opened it up, reaching inside and pulling out 2 cans of beer. He held one out, and Jinx took it, reacting with shock at the touch. "Where in the hell did you get cold beer at?" the corporal asked, his eyes widening. "I got a stash of beer hidden away," Zion said conspiratorially. "Always keep a handful in a net in the river. That bitch is colder than any refrigerator I ever owned." Jinx chuckled, shaking his head at the mastery as they popped the cans open. They held them up, and Jinx sobered. "To Stein," he said. "To Stein," Zion agreed, and they clinked before taking a sip. They savored every drop, knowing it was a rarity and wouldn't be around much longer. "Don't suppose you guys are restarting any breweries up there in Seattle, are you?" he asked. "If it were up to me, that's all we'd do," Jinx drawled. "Lock it down and drink until all this blows over." Zion chuckled. "You think this is going to blow over?" he asked, cocking a brow. "I'd be drunk. I wouldn't care," Jinx joked, and they shared a laugh. After a time, Zion leaned on the bridge railing and sighed. "How the hell did it get this bad?" he asked. "What are you talking about?" Jinx drawled, taking another sip. "It's always been this bad."
Zion gaped at him, eyebrows raised in a clear, "Are you for real?" expression. "Without the flesh-eating zombies, of course," Jinx amended, waving a hand. "People have always hated other people in this country. Hated the government, fought and killed each other over any number of bullshit reasons. All the dead did was give them a reason to do it on a larger scale." Zion paused and nodded. "Yeah, you got a point, man," he agreed. "Hell, I was just as guilty of the same thing back in the day. Gang fights, turf wars, just stupid bullshit. Nothing like this, though." "Not my first time either, sadly," Jinx admitted. After a few moments of just the river babbling, Zion asked, "So, you'll be honest with me?" "Always," the corporal replied immediately. "If they have what they say they have," Zion said, "armies, weapons, the whole nine, how bad can this get?" Jinx stared out over the water for a moment, taking a long swig and swallowing before responding. "Bad enough that we could lose a war against them," he admitted. "Lose Seattle, and if I'm being truly honest, lose the country." "Well, damn. Don't sugarcoat it or anything," Zion said with a sigh. "Hey, you asked," Jinx quipped, shrugging and taking another sip. "Yeah, I know. But damn," Zion said, shaking his head. "You really think they could pull that off?" "Motivated people defending their homes are capable of anything," Jinx said. "Saw more than my fair share of it overseas. This group is a lot more organized. They have highly trained and well-equipped people. And if they get desperate enough, anything's on the table." Zion contemplated this for a time, joining Jinx in just staring out at the water, drinking his beer. Finally, he asked, "Can I ask you something else?" "Sure," Jinx agreed with a shrug. "If you were in my position," Zion said slowly, "would you evacuate the civilians from this place?" Jinx thought for a few moments. "Nothing wrong with erring on the side of caution," he finally said. "There's plenty of room in Seattle, and at this point I get the feeling that Clint and Gad will give you whatever you ask for." "That will be my top request when I talk to them again, then," Zion said firmly. "I'll tell Captain Odom in the morning so we can start getting them prepared to move," Jinx added. "We might only have a week before the lid blows off this powder keg." "You think he's going to listen to you?" Zion asked, cocking a brow. He seemed pretty pissed. Jinx chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, he'll be fine," he said with a flick of his wrist. "He gives me a lot more leeway than others because of what I've been able to pull off. Plus, knowing what's coming, he's going to keep me on board." Zion chuckled and downed what was left of his can, crumpling the aluminum and tossing it aside. "Good Lord, man, you gotta savor that stuff," Jinx gasped. Zion smirked. "Maybe you ought to man up and finish yours," he said. "Nah, I'm good," Jinx said. "Enjoying this one too much to let it go that quickly." Zion grinned and reached into the cooler, pulling out 2 more. "There is more where that came from," he said. Jinx chuckled and shook his head before chugging the rest of his, tossing the can aside, and happily taking another. They cracked them open, raising them up, and the corporal took a deep breath. "To new comrades in arms," he said. Zion smirked. "Who are going to whoop militia ass up and down the West Coast," he declared. They clinked, letting out soft whoops before taking a drink. They turned back towards the water, savoring the beer and the peace and the fresh air and the companionship, knowing that small moments of joy like this would be few and far between. Whether they liked it or not, war was on the horizon. The end of the Portland conflict. Up next, the action shifts back to Seattle as Texas Ranger turned bounty hunter Atticus hits the rails